everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining tonight. Really excited to have you all on board here. Tonight, we've got Kristen DiBiase, who is your law school coach. She is a law school academic support expert, and she's here to share her expertise with us on law school prep. How are you doing, Kristen?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me, Steve.
Thanks so much for joining, Kristen. So I'm really excited to have you speak. I know you have a lot of experience in the law school prep space, academic support. And so I'm excited for you to share your expertise with everybody. And so, folks, there is a chat function here in Zoom, as you know, so please feel free to chime in at any point and pepper Kristen with questions. I know she has some questions for all of you as well. And so without further ado, Kristen, I'll hand it over to you and invite you to share with everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. So hi, everyone. As Steve said, I am Kristen DiBiase, and I am a law school academic support specialist. I've worked for 15 years empowering students in higher education, and I'd like to tell you really briefly about kind of the trajectory that I've had coming into what I do now. So I went to Valparaiso University School of Law and graduated in 2006 with my JD and a concentration in alternative dispute resolution. And after I came out of law school, I had a lot of experience working with student-focused groups, even when I was in the undergraduate space and in law school. So in law school, I was our Student Bar Association president, which I worked my way up through election to first the faculty 1L rep. My second year, I was elected secretary on a ticket, and then I led a ticket and won to become the president of Student Bar Association. I was also the vice president of the Black Law Students Association. So having that desire to work with and help students empower themselves in education has always been something that's really been close to my heart. So I was looking for an opportunity to do that in some type of advocacy role. And so ultimately, I ended up doing that working for the NCAA. So I worked there for almost a decade. And in the time that I was there, I was working in a quasi-legal function. So if we think about the laws of the land, this was the laws of the NCAA. So I was at some points a judicial branch officer working on adjudications of requests for waivers of NCAA legislation, so NCAA rules and laws. Other times I was helping to draft and write those as in a legislative function. And still other times there was an executive function where I worked a lot with committees as an administrator or a liaison. And one of the things that I ended up doing by virtue of being an individual who was diagnosed as an adult with ADHD was becoming an advocate for students who have ADHD and learning disabilities. So I was one of the first individuals in my department to be trained to work with ADA compliance and work very closely with the disability consultant there on cases that involve students with ADHD and disabilities. So that is a cause that is dear to my heart, and it got me thinking about the time that I had in law school and some of the things that I saw that happened with me and with other people I knew. I really, as I got more experience and got more opportunities and responsibilities, as you know, as you move up, you start to move a little bit further away from what brought you someplace in the first place. And I was really missing that one-on-one student-facing interaction as I became more and more of a high-level administrator. And so I decided that I wanted to go back to my roots and get back into academia. And so ultimately, I then did join a law school in the Midwest. I was at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, the Indiana School of Law, McKinney School of Law in Indianapolis, Indiana, where I was their Academic and Bar Success Associate Director. So in that role, I was able to really see the things that I had learned on my own as I'd gone through law school as a student, and then see them from the other side as well as an administrator. And I could see some patterns that were developing. It's interesting how as things change, things also remain the same. And so what I'd like to talk to you all about today in terms of law school prep is about the things that you don't know about law school that can hurt you. One of the things that I saw most frequently with the students that I worked with was that they were excited, they were confident, they felt great about going into law school because they'd had a lot of success. And something that usually will happen is that some students will kind of hit a little bit of a wall. And that's something that I like to talk to students about on the front end When you are being recruited by different law schools, you'll see that things look very rosy, very pretty, and there are some things that I feel that as administrators, it's our responsibility to tell students about. When I was working on the inside, so to speak, you kind of have to toe the party line, and that kind of happens kind of no matter where you are working. If you're working in administration for a law school, we're kind of all rowing in the same direction, so to speak. But as an individual working with students that I worked with every day who were running into difficulties academically, I just want to make sure that there are some things that you all know on the front end before you even go in, because you're not going to be told those things, maybe at all, or if you are told those things, it'll be much later than it would have been helpful to have heard about them in the first place. And I just like to really spare people as much pain and drama as possible, because law school in and of itself can be exhilarating, but it's also pain and drama in and of itself. So let's get started. I'm going to make sure that I've got my chat pulled up here too, just in case there's anything that ties in. I'm going to try to go for, I think, about maybe 40 to 45 minutes, and I'll be watching your questions. If there's something somebody asked that kind of dovetails with what I'm talking about right now, I might stop and address that right then. But if I don't, I'll definitely get to the questions at the end of when I'm speaking to you all. So if you've got a question about really anything that is sparked by what I'm telling you, or something that comes up, jogs your memory, makes you think, hey, I want to know about this, go ahead and pop that in the chat and we'll talk about it. All righty. So like I said, everybody talks about how law school is different. I'm sure you've all heard that as you are looking into taking the LSAT, as you're going through the process, as you're hearing things from other law students who are already in the law school space. And it's true, it really is different than undergrad, but what does that really mean? So let's talk about some of the biggest differences between law school and undergraduate study. The first thing right off, your classmates are different. As a body, they're going to be different from the students that you've previously encountered, the ones that you were around in high school and in college. When you went to college, you probably, encountered the same types of students that you encountered when you were in law school. There were some people that were very serious about getting those grades, kind of putting their nose to the grindstone, very hyper involved, lots of extracurriculars, really trying to do as much as they possibly can to be successful. And then you probably also saw some other people who weren't quite as motivated. Well, here you're going to see all the people that were in that first group, that first category, that are extremely motivated, extremely intelligent. All of a sudden, they're all together in the same place. And it's this crazy situation, because you may have been a big fish in a small pond in your high school, or swimming among a school of big fishes. Once you get to law school, every fish was a big fish in their pond, and now you're all together in this wonderful new brackish water, so to speak. So you probably encountered people when you were working in groups in high school that weren't pulling their weight. They were kind of slacking and letting you do things. That is a lot different when you get into law school, when you're in study groups. And we'll talk about that a little bit further on. Now, because everybody else in law school is just as competitive, just as motivated as you are, and just as smart, it's a different world. So here's something that you may not know. The American Bar Association, or the ABA, that's the organization that governs American law schools, the accredited American law schools. So any law school that's really worth its salt is going to be a member of the ABA. They have a set of rules that they put out that governs certain things that schools can and cannot do in their administration of and their operation of law schools. And one of the rules that they have is specifically one that prohibits them from admitting people who they do not believe have the capacity to be successful in law school. So if you get into law school, they believe you have the capacity to be there. So everyone who's getting in, automatically there is the assumption that you can do this work. So that's way different than, especially high school, where your education is compulsory and everybody's just required to be there. So the level of competition you're going to be encountering once you get into law school is elevated. It's much higher than you've probably ever seen before. You're in an environment where everybody did well in undergrad because that's how they got in. So most of your peers are going to be giving you a run for your money. And that is a feeling that can be very exciting because some people are like, wow, there's people that are on my level now. I want to see how I do with this. But it can also be a little frightening because it's like, whoa, do I feel like I can do this? Like, do I have the chops to run with the big dogs? And that's a feeling that is definitely something that every single person who has gone to law school has felt. Don't let them tell you they haven't, because they've felt it at least once. So the next thing that is different about law school compared to undergrad is that your learning environment and your expectations are different as well. The next major difference is what they're looking for from you as a student. So your typical undergraduate learning when you were in college went like this. You get assigned some reading to do. You do that reading outside of class. You take some notes on whatever you read. You come back into class, the next time you've got your course, and you're going to have the professor telling you all over again, almost all of the same exact information that you have read previously the night before or a couple of nights before. This is something that I call the instant replay. And that's because it's the basis of most undergraduate learning. It's really this concept of recitation and regurgitation. In law school, you're no longer going to be just strictly lectured at. You're going to be expected to engage with the material that you are being assigned and have it pretty well understood, at least as a basic premise, before you ever get to class. So in undergrad, you can expect, okay, every single thing that I studied and I read the night before, I'm going to hear all of that pretty much over again. Maybe some extra emphasis on one or two areas where the professor really wants to hit things home. It's completely different in law school. You could conceivably, and it happens often, do your reading assignment for that particular class. And then when you get there, there is a fraction, maybe only one case out of possibly, maybe you've got 6 or 7 cases that you had to read for that particular course. And the next time you come to class, you cover a part of one of them. And you actually never even talk about the other 6, the whole rest of the time that you're in that class. Now, this is where one of the very first mistakes that law students make that I like to point out right away. Now, having had your undergraduate education and knowing the flow of how undergrad works, the thing that you're going to think is, okay, they didn't cover it, so it's not important. Big mistake for law school. In law school, no matter whether they have talked about or not talked about something, you are expected to be responsible for knowing and understanding everything that is in your syllabus unless your professor explicitly tells you otherwise. So you're going to think, okay, well, we didn't talk about this. It's not important. That is absolutely not the case. And that's the number one first mistake that most law students who are not aware will make. And why would you not make that mistake? In the past, everything that you've seen tells you if it's not covered, it's not important. And that's not the case in law school. So unless your professor specifically says, hey, you guys, we ran out of time on such and such topic because it's just been so interesting, we're not going to be covering XYZ case, expect that you'll be covering XYZ case, and you'll have to incorporate that into your study. Another one of the most critical differences between your expectations for undergrad and your expectations for law school is the sheer amount of time that you need to devote to your studies. So there was a study, a study on studying that was done in the year 2011, where they took a survey of undergraduate institutions and they talked to students that were there about their study habits. They looked at the amount of time that the students were spending in classes, and they also did a survey of the type of activities that the students were engaging in within those classes. So here's what was really interesting. In that study, it was found that when you compare what students are working on and doing and studying in college today to what was done when students were in college in 1960, it is literally half the amount of work. Students are spending half the amount of time in actual classes than they spent in 1960. Students are spending half the time studying outside of classes that they were doing in 1960. And in pretty much any given course, students are doing about half the amount of comprehensive reading and writing activities in their courses as they were doing in 1960. Now, the problem here is that when you get to law school, the rigor and the depth and the requirements of what are necessary for law school have not changed a single bit over time at all. And so there's always been this learning curve that is there from anybody that's going to go from undergrad to law school. But now that curve is much more difficult because a lot of the fundamental kind of foundational learning skills and critical thinking and academic persistence, which is the ability to really stick with something when it gets hard or to engage in study activity for extended periods of time, there's less training in some of that students are getting nowadays. So you can be a top student, getting a great LSAT score, having a really good GPA, and just by dint of what is called the preparedness gap, it's not even your fault. It's the training that you have received from your undergraduate, your high school, your elementary education, all the way up until this point. It's just not as rigorous as it was in yesteryear. And that causes problems for students. So when we take a look at the amount of study that somebody has to engage in when they are in law school, as a first-year student, your general rule of thumb is that for every 1 hour that you're spending in a class in terms of a credit hour. So if you're in a 3-credit class, typically that's 3 hours of class time spent in actual class. For every single credit hour, so for every hour you spend in class, you should be spending 3 hours of time studying outside of class. Now, that's not just reading. It encompasses a lot of other activities, memorization activities, working in your outlines, taking notes, doing your case briefing, all of that good stuff that we do as law students can all count toward that study time. But it's a 3-to-1 ratio. Typically, when we take a look at the amount of time that students are doing in law school right now, 70% of 1L day students, so that's just a student that's in kind of the regular, normal 3-year academic program for daytime law school, not part-time, not the evening program. 70% of them study only about 30 hours or less outside of class, when at minimum, if you're taking kind of that regular day student schedule, it's usually 15 credit hours, you're looking at a minimum of 45, but anywhere between 45 and 60 hours of study outside of class. So it's a full-time job plus class that people are needing to do, but they typically are not, because that's just not something that students are used to doing. It's a lot more time. When I tell students that estimate, back when I worked inside a law school, we would always at the orientation tell them that estimate. We would show them and I still do this today with the students that I work with, we show them this is an example of what your class schedule looks like, not filled out. It's just got your classes on there on the calendar showing you here's such and such class from 2 o'clock to 3:30, and this class over here is at 10 a.m. until 11:30, and just blank. And then we show them a second page where we fill in, literally doing that math and showing all of that time on a day planner type calendar, how much time it fills up. It fills up their entire schedule. And students usually will visually recoil when they see that, and they just shake their heads like, no, it's not even possible. It can't be done, and it's a shock. It's a lot more time than people are used to spending. So that's another way that it's really different in terms of what you're doing in law school compared to undergrad. The next thing, the way that you're assessed is different. So another major difference here, the type of testing that's done in college. So we talked a little bit earlier about that resuscitation, because you're passing out. The recitation and regurgitation, that applies really to your testing as well. So you're probably more used to that. And at this point, what you have typically been exposed to as an undergraduate is something that is designed to be done in more frequent intervals in terms of testing. And the scientific word in learning science that learning science geeks like me like to use is called formative assessment. So formative assessment is things like quizzes, unit tests. These are done not only to give you an idea of how you're doing in a class and also your professor, but to give feedback that can give you and your professor insight on whether there's anything that they need to change in terms of what they are telling you, places where they feel like they need to put a little bit more emphasis. It's all about feedback for everyone involved, you and your professors. And that's pretty typical of undergraduate study. Unfortunately, because it really is a more effective way of learning, it has not really completely caught up to the law school atmosphere yet. There are professors who are heeding what learning scientists are talking about, and they are starting to incorporate more formative assessment into their teaching. So where I worked, there were some professors that would have quizzes every 2 weeks or so, and that's great. I wish that more professors would do that, because it really is more effective for your learning and for them in terms of what they should be working on teaching you, or being able to tell when people aren't getting a concept. But largely, legal academia has not incorporated formative assessment so far. So what that means is, you're gonna be stuck with kind of the way things have been done up until this point. So what that looks like in law school, you're still doing what's called summative assessment. It's one thing that sums things up at the end. So think of it that way. This is designed to evaluate your cumulative learning over an extended period of time. So in law school, your entire course grade for a lot of people is determined by one exam that comes at the very end of the term. Now, if you're lucky, you've got a midterm that's in there, but not everybody does them. I loved having the midterm because as an administrator and as a student, I found it very instructive, because a lot of times when law students make common 1L mistakes, the midterm gives them an opportunity essentially to realize, whoa, I'm in trouble. I need to figure something out. It's a real opportunity for the come to Jesus moment, so to speak. And I had one of those myself as a 1L in my first semester. I got a D on my crim law midterm. I've never seen a grade so low in my entire life. It was completely foreign to me, but it was what I needed to realize, okay, I got to figure something out. I need to change up what I'm doing. And I was able to turn that around. And I was able to finish that class out with a whopping C+. Now, I know that sounds horribly pathetic, but when you think about a grade that is worth 50% of your score in a class, if you bring one grade that is a D and the other grade's a C+, what did I get? Yeah, I got an A- on my final. That's the difference that I'm talking about here. So midterms and formative assessment are really good tools. And with the students that I work with, I talk to them about how to create your own formative assessment opportunities in the absence of formalized formative assessment. Now, without having that formalized formative assessment structure built in, a lot of students will flounder. They just don't know how they're doing in the class until the end, when it's too late, because you take the exam and that's it. You get your feedback, but there's nothing you can do to change it by that point. And so that's one of the things I always like to focus on with the students that I coach. So I talked earlier again about that instant replay. The same thing applies to your college exams. When you're in the exam, if you're able to take everything that you've been hearing from your professor, take everything you got from, your PowerPoints, the notes that you took, if you can memorize it all well enough and spit it right back on paper, on that multiple choice exam, pick the right thing, you're pretty much on the road to an A in that class, right? Not how law school works at all. Memorization is absolutely crucial. It's critical for law school. But when we're looking at the pyramid, the structure of the skills that are necessary for law school success, memorization is down here. There are kind of 3 tiers on this pyramid, and memorization is the bottom. It's the absolute minimum that you have to be able to do before you can do anything else with what you are learning. So when you are doing memorization, that's all you need to get the stuff that you're working on in your mind so you can start to play with it. Memorization is one of the building blocks that you use to put together your structure of learning. Because after memorization, it's like, okay, great, we've got our memorization. But our real mastery then comes to taking what you have learned, what you've memorized, applying it, and analyzing that application. So that's where the real mastery and all of the points on your exams come from. It's not good enough to just memorize a bunch of case names and memorize, the way that the black letter law or the rules work and spit those back out. That's kind of the minimum to get in the door at the party. You're not even on the dance floor yet at that point. So some other things that I like students to know up front. Really quickly, how many hours outside of class? So for in class, if you're taking 15 credits, you're looking at a minimum of 45 hours of time outside of class. So it's, again, for every 1 hour in class, so every credit equals an hour, 3 hours of time. So whatever number of credits you're taking in class, multiply it times 3, and that's going to be the amount of time for your course load that you're going to need outside of class. And the one exception that we make to that is when you are working on legal research and legal writing, you don't need a 3-to-1 ratio on those. You will need it for your writing assignments to make sure you've got significant time to work on those, but you're not going to need a regular 3-to-1 ratio of study time to work on legal writing classes because you don't have a ton that you're reading outside of the class. Okay, so things that you should know up front. These are some more things that I think is really important to tell students about that is typically not going to be told to them at 1L orientation, because at 1L orientation, they don't want to scare you because anybody who's seen the paper chase, they really want to try to get away from that. So I feel like a little bit sometimes that law schools have kind of shifted in the other direction where they think that everyone is very delicate and fragile and they don't want to shatter your spirits. I think there's a healthy medium in there, in between, where we're able to tell you some things that you do need to know up front, because I'm a person, I don't know about you, but I'm a person where I want to know as much as possible. I want to know every possible data point that I can consume, because the more data I have, the more secure it makes me feel, because the more options I have for decision making. I'm all about having as much data as possible. Sometimes my husband calls me the computer and he'll look at me and say beep, boop, boop, and I say shut up. But as much information as I can give people as possible, I try to give on the front end, because law school is expensive. I mean, if it's not going to be something that's the right choice for you, I feel people should know that before they get into it, save them from making a costly and very expensive decision that they may otherwise not have made had they known more information. So the other thing that I want to tell you about and why is because some of this information that people hear, they have an idea in their head based on what they did in undergrad on when some of that information should come into play, and it's typically not the same timeline for law school. So I know, having been on both sides, being a law student and then being a law school administrator, I know that when you actually need some of this information is much earlier than when you're going to think you actually need that information. So I like to make sure that I tell people this up front, and it comes kind of randomly, sometimes not necessarily in sync with everything else that I'm talking about, just because I want to make sure that they get those points. So here's something important that I like to tell students, because they are never going to tell you this when you go to your recruiting fairs, your admissions fairs, your law school days, or at orientation. If you're getting a scholarship, I want you to be aware. So many students are going to receive some kind of scholarship to attend law school. Like when you look at the 509 disclosures from law schools, and you look at some of the indicators that talk about how much aid students got and how much of a percentage of their cost of attendance was received in these scholarships. You see, a lot of people are getting some serious money, anywhere between a quarter and maybe half of their education is being paid for by some type of scholarship. So this information covers a lot of different people. Now, here's the thing. A lot of people are going to, wave the money in front of you, a half ride, a full ride, some kind of chunk of money that's enough to really turn your head and make you start thinking, hey, maybe I want to go to that law school. Well, here's the thing. Law schools are not just, lovely paragons of virtue who want to grow and educate the next series of lawyers, the next generation of our beautiful legal mind trust. They're businesses, okay? So they're trying to make money as well. That's what they are about. At the end of the day, they're a business just like any other organization. So regardless of the kind of scholarship you're getting, you need to be very careful and look at any conditions that are put on that money, because the scholarship game is how law schools make their money. So let's talk about the scholarship game. You want to look at the terms and conditions that surround your financial aid, because depending on what they are, they can be very, very onerous. So here's the thing. Typically, a law school will often require that you get a certain GPA to retain your scholarship. Conditional scholarships have different types of conditions on them. If you're getting a scholarship and you are looking for the most promising condition, the most promising condition you can look for is in good academic standing. That's usually going to be kind of the lowest bar that anybody has to hop over. If you're not in good academic standing, you're already kind of on the road to additional problems, and we'll kind of talk about that too tonight. But if you are conditioned on whatever aid that you're receiving, then the condition that you want to look for, the one that you want to see, is in good academic standing. That's kind of the basic scholarship that everybody has kind of received, even in undergrad. Get decent grades that are not going to put you in danger of getting kicked out of school, and will let you keep your money. That's the best condition you can find if you have the condition. Now, obviously, I've rarely seen anybody give one, but the best one is the one that's unconditional. You've got 3 years of, full ride scholarship to come to us university, and it doesn't matter what grades you get. We're going to let you follow through. I've never seen it. So the closest to that you can get is in good academic standing. From that point, it kind of starts going downhill. And this is not to say that you should not take a scholarship that is offered to you. If it's a serious amount of cash, this is an expensive proposition that you're looking at. So you just need to make sure that you are aware of what those conditions are. So at nearly every law school, there is a percentage of students who will lose their scholarship due to the distribution of the grade curve. This is especially the case if the law school starts playing some of the games that they play with the scholarship game. So what did we talk about a little bit earlier? You are the best and brightest, so is every single classmate of yours. So among the best and the brightest, there's the bestestest and the brightestest, right? The people that got like the high dollar amounts because their LSATs were in the stratosphere and they had a 4+.0 or whatever. Something that some law schools will do, they're going to take you, and I hope I'm not dating myself here, that people actually know who this is, but Doogie Howser. They're going to take you and Doogie Howser, and that kid from the TV show right now who's like a doctor and he's like 17 years old, that's not Doogie Howser, and it comes on CBS. All of you guys who are law students, they're going to put you all together in the same section. And now you are competing as like the big battle folk in the same section, and you're all on the same curve. And that's going to force some people to get a lower grade or set of grades than others, just by virtue of they put you, Thunderdome, Mad Max style, all together in the same section. Okay, I will come back to that question at the end. If that happens, you have got to really be careful, because here's the other secret they don't tell you. You can be the smartest, the brightest, the most hardworking, and sometimes it just doesn't matter. The curve is a curve for a reason. It is mathematically designed to make people fall in a certain pattern, because there's something else that occurs. And we'll talk about it in just a second, called mandatory attrition. And that's a scary place to be as well. Thank you. Yes, it's the Good Doctor. Thank you. My mom watches CBS all the time. I don't, which is why I didn't know who this kid was, but I saw an ad. Okay. So here's where you've really got to start thinking about the sunk cost fallacy. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying I am not telling you, if you lose your scholarship after 1L year, leave law school, never to return. That is not what I'm saying. But I do want to point out to you some of the psychological factors that come into play with the scholarship game, because it's a game that they are playing and the things are stacked in favor of the house. So here's how this plays out. When you pursue or continue to do something that makes you unhappy, or it puts you in a worse off position simply because of the resources that you previously deployed, that's what the sunk cost fallacy is doing, okay? And so in this situation, in losing a scholarship, this is how that plays out. You emotionally, once you have gone through a semester of law school, let alone once you get through the first year of law school, you are a different person. Emotionally, you have been through the ringer. You have gone through it. You know, anybody who knows somebody who became a Marine, they tell you that the Marines, they take you, they break you down, they build you back up again, and you are a new person. That's what law school does too. Maybe not with as many oorahs, but that's what law school does to you mentally. By the time you finish your first year of law school, you are mentally in such a place that you are thinking, oh my goodness, if I lose my scholarship, I've got to keep going because I have gone so far. I have done so much. Now, if you take emotion out of it and you just back up and look at it just rationally for a moment, mathematically, because, you know, your regular daytime school is a 3-year program, you're only 1/3 of the way through a 3-year program. You're not even halfway through that process. But they know that psychologically, by the time you finish 1L, you are going to be so invested that you're going to pick up the tab for those second 2 years and you're going to run with it. And now you're paying them to be at law school. And that's what the scholarship game is. So you've got to be careful and really watch what's happening when you get those conditional scholarships. And this is why I tell people that they should really invest in getting academic coaching, because the consequences are very, very dire. They're very high. I tell people, you know, you've got an iPhone, you've got the new Android, you bought the protection plan, right? You got Apple Care when you bought that $1,000 phone, didn't you? You got your MacBook, you know, you got your Surface. You bought the protection plan when you got those, didn't you? So what's your protection plan for this $140,000 educational investment that you're about to embark on? Okay? Be careful when it comes to the scholarship game. Now, it's not just scholarships that can be a problem. So now let's talk about what's called mandatory attrition. Now, in the same way that the curve is going to force some people to lose part or all of their scholarship, there are some schools that practice a practice called mandatory attrition. At certain schools, the way that their curve is laid out, it is going to automatically mean that between 5 to 10 or 15, depending on which school it is, it varies from school to school, 5 to 10 or 15% of 1Ls will flunk out of law school at the end of the first year. That's a lot of people. That's a big percentage. It's a scary percentage. And I'm sure that when you are going in, you're not thinking, oh yeah, I'm not going to be one of those, you know, I'm not going to be one of the people that is forced to leave because of where things land on the curve. But it can happen because, again, everybody that comes in is just as smart. That's how they got there in the first place. So you really have to be careful when you are taking a look at what schools you are wanting to attend. Make sure that you're looking at their attrition rates. How many people are flunking out of law school or leaving law school? Will be generous. How many people are leaving law school at the end of their first year? you want to really optimally see less than 5%, because there are some schools that don't have mandatory attrition. And if a school has a high attrition rate, it says one of two things. Either they have mandatory attrition where they're forcing people because of the way they've set up their curve to leave, or there's something going on there, because why are so many people, if they don't have mandatory attrition, flunking out after 1L year? So keep those numbers in mind when you are looking at and weighing the institutions that you are looking to apply to and or attend if you are offered. Those two things together, the attrition rate and the number of students who leave or lose their scholarship based on the conditions that are there. You've really got to take a look at those. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about, let's say, okay, you haven't necessarily lost your scholarship. You are not going to flunk out. There are still bad things that can happen academically. And I want to talk now about academic warning and academic probation. This is going to vary from school to school, depending on what their particular policy is. I always go with my school that I worked at because that's the policy I know best. But when I know that it's different at other schools, I also try to include that information and tell people about as well. So some schools, their mandatory attrition, it kicks in after the first semester. There are some schools that will have people who are asked to leave, who are dismissed from law school after only one semester of time. I personally don't think that's fair, because listen to all the things I've already told you up until this point. When you come into law school, you have done so well in undergrad, you have no clue that what you are going to do, if you're going to do the same thing that you did in undergrad, is not necessarily going to work for you. Because why would you think it's not going to work? It's worked very well up until this point. I always say, and I say this to the students that I worked with when I was inside the law school after the semester, and we're working together because they're on academic warning. Look, anybody can have a bad semester. Because I didn't have a bad semester my 1L year, but I had a bad semester, compared to how I feel I should be doing academically and how I had done academically. That was not my best work, I really felt like something's happening here. This is not my usual level of doing well that I'm used to. And that happens to a lot of people in law school, because it's just different. It's different. So I don't believe that schools should do mandatory attrition, number one, at all. But if they do it, they should definitely not be doing it after one semester, because anybody can have a bad first semester in law school. It sometimes just takes a whole semester to get the hang of things, and then people will recover. They get their stride, they are going on, and it is fine. Oh my goodness, it's already 8:45. Okay, let me just tell you one other thing here about stuff that you should know in terms of things you're not going to realize. You only get one shot with grades in terms of big law. So let me first say that there is much more to life than big law. And when I talk about big law, I have an expanded kind of version of this. So a lot of people will talk about big law as being the biggest, nationally ranked, well-known white shoe firms that have 5 people's names on the masthead, but they are known by one name that everybody knows. That is definitely the biggest of big law. But honestly, whatever state you live in, any large, well-paying law firm, I like to lump that in with big law, because that really gives people options in terms of feeling like they need to be going to like one of the T14. Yeah, you don't have to go to to get into a big law firm. They have a big law firm in basically every state. You just need to get into the best in that state. There's the locality strategy that comes into play there. Okay, I will get to those questions after. Okay, so if you're not looking at big law, your world opens up. The world is your oyster. There is so much more to being a lawyer than just that small kind of sphere. There are lots of other things that you can do, and your grades do not become as make or break and in your 1L first semester as they are if you're trying to get OCI. And as we're on the topic really quickly about OCI, only like 10% of big law type jobs are even filled through OCI. it's really still about making connections and getting out there and getting to know people. So just don't feel that pressure that people think you have to get in a T14, and if you don't, your life is over. It's not like that. It's really not. Now, one thing I do want to tell you, even if the world is your oyster because you're not aiming for big law, you cannot be complacent with your grades. And here is why. Your grades are still going to be really important because they directly correlate with how well you are predicted to do on the bar exam. So everybody talks about how, you get this really high LSAT score, like you're gonna do well on the bar exam. But it turns out that your GPA from while you're actually in law school is a much better predictor of your overall success on the bar exam than your LSAT score ever will be. And the reason for it is this: the skills that you are learning in law school that you'll have to practice on exams, those are the same types of skills you're going to then be called to learn and show and demonstrate when you take the bar exam. So if you're not good at taking essay questions when you're in law school, you're not going to be good at doing essay questions on the bar. If you're not good at doing multiple choice questions when you're in law school, you may be a little better at them on the bar. Some of the multiple choice questions can get kind of crazy in law school, but generally speaking, your performance in law school is directly indicative on how your performance will go on the bar. And here's the magic numbers for cutoffs, okay? There are 3 different buckets that students typically fall in GPA-wise. There is anybody who has a 3.2 or higher. There is anyone who has below a 2.6, and there is everybody else who's in between those 2 GPA numbers. If you have a 3.2 cum GPA at the time that you graduate from law school, there's a fairly high probability that you will pass the bar after taking the bar only once, assuming that you continue the study habits and skills and you don't slack off on your bar review. If you put in a modicum of effort and you do what you did in law school, you'll probably pass the bar on the first try. For the people who are below the 2.6 GPA as a cumulative cutoff, there is a very high probability that they will not pass the bar on the first try. They may not pass the bar on the second try or the third try or ever. And it's unfortunate. Every time you have to retake the bar, a smaller number of people who retake will actually pass. So it's important to make sure that you do as well as you can while you're still in law school and you learn those strategies and skills, because you're going to be tested on them again. And I would hate for people to go through, the exhilaration and personal hell that is 3 years plus of law school, depending on which program you're doing, and then come out on the end and you don't pass the bar, because that's what it ends up being all about. You got to get past that bar to go out there and save the world or make the big money or go after those shady banks. You got to pass the bar, okay? If you get a C or C minus in a class, you're going to be upset, especially if it's like one of the worst grades you've ever seen in your life. But part of you in the back of your head is kind of going to think, okay, this is bad. But it could be worse. It's not bad. It's not bad. It's a C. It's a C minus. And then you're going to feel a little bit better. I don't want to step on your dreams and crush you, but don't feel better. Because here's the big secret thing that nobody ever says, and I don't know why they wouldn't do it. In law school, a C is an F. Remember that. A C is an F in law school. Some law schools do give out D's and F's, but you've got to work so hard to get a D or an F on your actual final exam. Some professors, psychologically, they will grade low and give people lower grades on a midterm if they have a midterm to motivate them to kind of essentially do what I did and turn it around. But when it comes to final exams, you mostly are not going to see D's and F's unless the person literally walked in, hawked a loogie on the paper, flipped the professor or, the proctor of the bird and walked back out. You've got to try really hard to get a D or an F because most professors will not give them. The reason that they don't do it is because it messes with the curve. Doesn't matter how many people write well on an exam, how many people have the information, they are going to judge each of the people and what they do against the best paper or what their idea of the best paper is, and they do not give out very many A's. There's going to be a very small handful, maybe 5 or less, that are A's or maybe A pluses. And everybody else, they all get, you know, A minuses or B pluses, all the way down to typically, you know, the C and C minus range, because C's and C minuses are easier to balance numerically with B's and B pluses. If you give a D or an F, you've got to get some type of an A that's really going to balance that out numerically. And that's just if you are doing just a straight up and down regular bell curve where a C is at the top of the curve. Most law schools do not have a C as the top of their curve, and that's why a C ends up being the F of law school. They're going to have a shifted curve. Where I worked, for example, the curve is a 3.1 overall class GPA. So a 3.1 is the very top of your curve, and everything else is shifted over. So that's why you don't see a lot of D's and F's, but you should know if you get a C or a C minus, it's not as good of a grade as you think it is. And of course, we all think that it's like, it's not good, but it's okay because it's average, because we've had 18 years where a C is actually a C. They're not going to tell you that a C is an F, but a C is like an F. So know that as you're going in too. Okay, let me see. I have been just running my mouth this whole time, and I want to make sure that there's a couple other things that I get to. We talked about the bar exam. Okay, really quickly, before I start taking some questions here, I just want to go into some info that I've got. I really like people to know about if you have ADHD or you have a learning disability. So I wasn't diagnosed with ADHD until I was an adult because I'm what they call twice exceptional. There's a lot of people who, especially if you're in law school and you have ADHD, you're probably twice exceptional. What that means is you have some other kind of neuro thing. For me, I was gifted and I had ADHD. There's a lot of people who have ADHD who are gifted who are in law school. When you look at the adult population, 4.4% of people in the adult population have ADHD, have an official diagnosis of ADHD. In the legal profession, 12.5% of lawyers have ADHD. So that tells you something, okay? And if you ever think about the number of people that come out on the back end of things, like some of the stats I like to throw out, Black and brown people. Black people are only 5% of the legal profession. Brown people are only 5% of the legal profession. On the front end of all of those stats, the 5%, the 5%, the 12.5%, there were many more people on the front end of that. And we lose people. There is attrition for people who have ADHD, for people who are first generation law students, for people who are law students of color, between when they start and whether they make it to the exam and make it to the legal profession. So when you are somebody who has a learning disability or you have ADHD, it is extremely important, and I encourage anyone, if you already know you have it for sure, I encourage people, highly encourage them to disclose their condition to your Office of Disability Services on your campus. Now, there's a lot of people who are like me, who got diagnosed as adults because we somehow just got lucky because we were kind of nerdy and enjoyed school, so we didn't do badly in school. So we got overlooked, and we got all the way to the point where we finally hit a wall, and then we get diagnosed. There's other people who have been diagnosed ever since they were kids because maybe they have a little bit more H in their ADHD. People who were diagnosed before the point that they get to high school, or before the point that they get to college, or before the point that they get to law school, sometimes start to recognize what works for them and what doesn't work for them, and they start to self-accommodate and use their own coping mechanisms and strategies that make them successful. If you're a student that has done this in the past, I still encourage you, highly, highly encourage you, disclose the disability to your Office of Disability Services and ask for accommodations. Here's why. I don't care if you don't use them or not, but what happens a lot of times is students who have gotten used to being successful with their own self-accommodation, or people that are worried about the stigma of being known as somebody who has ADHD, who don't disclose, when they get to law school, the amount that you are juggling, your ability to be able to handle that and self-compensate, it is outpaced. And that's how I got diagnosed when I first started in my working career. You just start to have a lot more of demands on you, and you're not able to juggle it all. You start dropping balls and you're like, whoa, what's happening? That can happen to students who have been successful in high school. Sometimes it happens when they go to college. Sometimes they're okay in college, and it happens to them when they go to law school. So I tell people, go ahead, disclose ahead of time, ask for your accommodations, because you don't have to use them. But law schools in particular are notorious for, especially when they are part of a larger university system, they're notorious for being slow and not having the resources that they need to help the number of people who need help in an expedient manner. What I don't want you to do is to realize, oh, wow, I am hitting that wall. I am like starting to drop balls. I need help. I need my accommodations. And now you are, in the waiting process where it's taking weeks to months for you to go through the process, because maybe you need to get additional paperwork, or you need to get retested, or things like that. I want you to have the control of deciding, yeah, I got these accommodations. I don't feel like I need them. I'm not going to use them. But if you decide that you do want to use them, you already have them there for you, especially if you're going to end up needing extra time on exams. You do not want to be against the wall trying to get that put into place before you get to midterms, before you get to your final exams. So that is my PSA for people who have ADHD or other learning disabilities who have not necessarily always disclosed their diagnosis to the campus. Okay, so let me take a look at some of these questions that people asked. Steve told me that it was okay if we went over a little bit. I do want to be respectful of people's time, however, so if you need to hop off or something, I will not be offended. I can be very long-winded, and that's just something I know about myself, so I want to make sure that I answer the questions that people asked here. So, okay, we definitely answered that one about hours outside of class. Thank you, Steve. Conditional scholarships, yes. Okay, are there other factors that admissions uses to evaluate or determine capability of success or scholarships besides LSAT and GPA stats? Yes, absolutely. Your letters of recommendation and the things that are on your resume. They are going to be looking at you as a holistic individual, because they are looking to try to shape the class that they have. So it's not going to be just numbers. I sat in the other day on an mock admissions panel that the West Coast Consortium held, because yes, that's the kind of dork that I am. I just like to hang out in places where people are given law school information. But I was in there, and they walked through, and they had some redacted, cleaned up versions of different people's factors in what they sent in. And they look at all kinds of things for people. It is not going to just be your LSAT and your GPA. Now, a lot of schools will heavily factor the LSAT and the GPA. I know not very many schools will disclose what their admissions ranking, like their rating system is. Some schools do. And of the ones that do, what I've seen is like a 60-40 split. 60 is your LSAT, 40 is your GPA. But that can't be everything. If people are going just on numbers, then you start to see a very homogenized, kind of boring class group. And what they want is people that can grow and expand the minds of the people around them, not just the people that they may help when they join the legal profession. They are looking for drive, they are looking for customer service, the ability to care about other people. So they're looking at all kinds of things. And the best thing that you can use to show those other facets of you, besides just those numbers, that GPA, that LSAT, is your letters of recommendation. I think the number one thing that they talked about that I absolutely agreed with on that mock admissions panel the other day was your letters of recommendation. You really want them to show and not tell. So if you have somebody that's your letter of recommendation and they're able to explain something that underpins one of the pillars, like when I talk to people about working on their application, and I typically am not an advisor for application processes, but if people have a question, I'll answer it honestly because I worked inside a law school. I tell people, make sure that you are positioning yourself. Like you are a personal brand. Like what brand are you trying to show? And your pillars of your brand, like one word things that describe who you are. So if I had to brand myself, I would say, you know, geeky, integrity, eccentric. Probably not the best three to try to get into a law school, but like those are three things that if you hear those three things, you're like, yes, that is definitely Kristen DiBiase. You know what I mean? So if you've got a letter of recommendation and the thing that you're trying to position yourself is as is hardworking overcomer, maybe that's how you're positioning yourself. I'm a hardworking overcomer because I had XYZ thing that happened to me and I worked hard and I overcame those things. Then what better than a letter of recommendation where the person who's writing that letter for you is able to give an illustrative example of how you worked hard and overcame. So maybe it's like a GPA thing. So-and-so took 3 classes with me. In the very first class, she got a 2.8 GPA in that course. But as she took 2 more classes with me, she dramatically improved her grade because of the amount of time that she spent working with our TA and consistently coming to office hours and such and such. You know, so it's not, she was a very bright and inquisitive student. Well, how was she bright and inquisitive? If you can give any feedback to your LOR writers before they do it, is if you've got hard examples of the things that I'm trying to position myself for, please speak to those. So that's definitely what they are looking at. They want to see you as a real person. Who's the person behind these numbers? What explains those numbers? What explains who this person is? And all of those things, your letters, what you say about yourself, how you position and brand yourself, should all be a comprehensive package that each individual element enhances or explains another. So it should be this total package with an explanation. Thank you, Virginia. Okay. Thank you to Cora for dropping their dropout rates. Yeah, that's a pretty good link. I have gone to that link before myself. It's kind of hard to find some of this data. I can't believe that I'm necessarily advising this, but there are a lot of people you kind of have to watch out for because they can get kind of weird and salty. But law school Reddit is not bad. They've got some pretty, you know, legit people in there. Just watch out for the trolls, but law school Reddit is not bad. How do you recommend compensating as a slow reader with the quantity of reading required? Okay. The number one thing I'm going to tell you to not do is to not take the shortcuts. Because if you take the shortcuts, that is what's going to cause you more problems. So a lot of people are like, oh man, I'm reading so slow. That's normal, honestly. When you first start reading, you could probably read for an hour and get through a page, maybe a page and a half, especially in civil procedure. Because civil procedure is the one course, I think it's the hardest course in 1L. Because it's the one that's not really like anything else that you've really encountered before. And the cases start so far back in time, they talk in old highfalutin language that's hard enough to read on its own because it's not Shakespeare. It's gonna be slow going when you first start reading, but the more you read and the more that you take those specific elements of a case, when you do your briefs, you will start to read faster because you're going to learn how to read with intention. You're going to learn how to read and look for those different pieces of your cases, and your reading speed will increase. Now, if you're just a slow reader in general, honestly, that's okay. But you just have to know ahead of time that you're going to need to take a little bit more time. So if I say, you know, again, the 3-to-1 ratio of studying, when you first start, law school in the first couple of weeks, like all 3 of those hours are going to be all reading. Like, no joke. It's going to take a lot of time. So maybe you add on some additional time. Don't really beat yourself up about the length of time it takes you to read when you first start, because it will get better. The more you practice it, though, that's the way that it gets better. If you take the shortcut by getting canned briefs instead of working through the briefing, doing your own briefs yourself, you're never going to get that acuity in reading speed. If you, heaven forbid, like, this is the thing where I'm like, okay, why are you in law school if you're using canned briefs instead of even doing the reading? Like, that's all. Like, we're not even going to talk about that, because that should not be an option for anybody here. So as you get practice on isolating and identifying the different elements of a case, the elements that are common to essentially all cases, through doing your case briefing, you will speed up. I promise. I promise you will. Is it common for government agencies to request law school grades for civil service positions? Yeah, so big law was definitely not me either. I'm sure just in this short hour that we've all been talking, you could probably see how I wouldn't quite fit in there. But I'm not really sure about government agencies. For civil service, I'm going to say, yeah, most likely, especially if you're doing it right out of school. But that's like the body of your work, essentially. They're going to probably want to request that. And here's the thing, you won't necessarily know why they're requesting it. It could depend on the type of job that you're doing. Some places, they're requesting your transcript because they want to prove that you actually did get a degree. Because there's those people who, honestly, I don't know why you would do this in today's, time, the age that we live in with the wonders of the internet. But there are people who still lie about having gone to certain schools and having attained certain degrees. So literally, just to verify that you actually did go to a school and get a degree from a school, they're gonna want your transcripts. Now, depending on what the particular position is, they may actually read them as well. But I would say most likely, yeah, they're gonna wanna see it. So it doesn't really matter what you're trying to do. You always wanna get the best grades that you possibly can, because the best grades just make things a lot easier. You don't have to have quite as sparkling a personality. You can be a horribly dull person who is not fun to be around, but still get a pretty decent job if you've got a really, really, really high law school GPA. You're not going to be very fun at parties, but like, you can still do pretty well. Okay, law school transparency. Yes, thank you, Steve. Exactly. 509 reports. Yes. Okay, so we've already gotten to the end of the questions that are put in here, so Steve's going to hop on.
Yeah, Kristen, thank you so much for an incredibly informative and interesting presentation. I know that I learned a lot, and I'm sure that all the students learned a lot as well. I especially appreciate your just emphasizing the importance of this journey and the importance of being careful about advocating for the students' best interests relative to the law schools and telling students what they need to know before getting in. So I really appreciate your sharing all your advice. We're getting some positive feedback in the chat as well, as we have gotten all this great engagement over the course of the evening. So I'm really glad to have connected with you and for you to be so generous to share your time with everyone. What's the best way for students to get in touch with you if they're interested in getting further support on their law school journeys?
Yeah, so my email address is lawschoolcoaching@gmail.com. I have a website. It's yourlawschoolcoach.com. So that's pretty easy to find me there. And I think of the social medias, I am on Twitter at lawschool_coach, but I am mostly on Instagram at lawschool_coach. So those are probably the easiest ways that you can get in contact with me. If you don't want to email me directly, I do have a contact form that's on my webpage. I just joined TikTok. I'm scared of this. I don't know. Like, I think it looked okay. I've got one talk or tick, whatever you want to call it, up there. So I'm always looking for suggestions on things that people want to see, because that's the kind of stuff that I want to put out there. Stuff that like you actually care about, that you find valuable.
Definitely, definitely. Well, I've checked out some of your social stuff, and it has been remarkably engaging. It's definitely not the big law vibe. Definitely more the TikTok vibe, which I'm also still trying to learn myself. But I guess we'll figure it out with time. But again, thank you so much. I would definitely encourage everyone to get in touch with you, and just thank you again, Kristen. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Steve. It was really great talking to all of the students here, and you're very, very welcome, everybody who was here on the call. Please contact me if you've got any questions.
Fantastic. Well, again, thanks everyone for joining. Have a good night all, and I'll see you all soon. Bye, everybody. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.